Nearly 5 years after its announcement at the unveiling of the Nintendo Switch, Shin Megami Tensei V is finally here. It's a continuation of the 3-decade-old JRPG series, and the first entry on home consoles since 2004's Shin Megami Tensei III. Intriguingly, it's a technically ambitious Switch exclusive that makes use of Unreal Engine 4. There's a huge increase in scope and graphical accomplishment compared to prior RPGs by Atlus, the series developer. It's an impressive achievement. A high-end rendering engine, advanced visuals, and an open design. It's safe to say that you don't see these elements come together very often on the Switch. But have these technical efforts come at a frame rate cost? And how does image quality and stability fare on Nintendo's hybrid system? Shin Megami Tensei V tells the story of a high school student who is suddenly drawn into the world of the paranormal. The main character finds himself transported into a ruined version of Tokyo while investigating some strange rumors, and finds himself thrust into an epochal conflict between angels and demons. Shin Megami Tensei V differentiates itself from prior Atlus RPGs with a wide-open gameplay design. The main combat areas are large and somewhat non-linear. It's not an open world game, but the design here feels surprisingly expansive. These regions of post-apocalyptic Tokyo serve as the primary gameplay venue here, which are interrupted every so often with returns back to modern-day Tokyo and brief glimpses of school life. There are some interesting and well-executed story beats between the long excursions into ruined future Japan. But make no mistake, the emphasis here is on combat. Combat is a highly strategic, turn-based affair that involves keeping track of enemy and party weaknesses and strengths and exploiting them for extra moves. It's somewhat reminiscent of the Pokemon games, albeit at a higher level of difficulty and complexity. The basics will be familiar to people who have played Shin Megami Tensei before or Persona, although there are some interesting additions here. Players can now change their attribute weaknesses, for instance, and can exploit powerful time-limited Magatsui skills that enhance player abilities. The classic Shin Megami Tensei demon negotiation and fusion systems also make a return, which prove essential if you want to be strong enough to progress. And you'll need to be very strong indeed, owing to Shin Megami Tensei V's high level of difficulty. It's punishing but fair, with an emphasis on strong tactics and good party composition. You can't just expect to one-shot every battle here. There are some very challenging fights. Developing your party through completing side quests and fusing demons is also essential, as otherwise you'll find yourself badly underleveled. On the whole, I think it's a successful progression of the concepts in prior Shin Megami Tensei titles, though admittedly some of the combat sections do drag on a bit. Some of the grinding in particular is a little egregious and feels unnecessary. This isn't a huge issue in my opinion, however, and the experience overall is well worth recommending. But that's enough about the gameplay. What about the tech? Well, let's start with what works. The basic elements of the visuals hold up well enough here. Character models are stylized, with semi-realistic 3D shading that straddles the line between the cel-shaded Persona 5 and the flat lighting of Shin Megami Tensei III. There's a healthy amount of character detail and animation, with the main character's flowing hair being a particular highlight. Compared to prior Atlus titles, the character models also see some improvement. The lighting on this jack-o'-lantern character, for instance, is a clear step up above the same model in Persona 5. If you look closely, you can see that his lamp is now a real light-casting source. We've moved away somewhat from the basic lighting in this prior game. The actual model and animation, however, seem identical, as seems to be the case for other enemies in the game. Environments look attractive as well. There's a reasonable level of detail and sometimes impressive scale. The ruined Tokyo cityscapes are well realized, with a stylized and visually cohesive look, held together with effective color grading and post-processing. By comparison, interiors often look a bit boxy and plain, although there are some exceptions. This area, for instance, showcases realistic materials and shading. The stonework looks very convincing, and we see a nice bit of baked global illumination here as well. Much of that materials work and lighting owes a lot to Unreal Engine 4, which is the engine at the heart of Shin Megami Tensei V. This isn't a typical deployment of UE4, however. There's no temporal anti-aliasing, for instance, or ambient occlusion. The image looks very raw as a result, although perhaps this is a good choice given the blurriness of TAA at low resolutions. What UE4 does deliver here, in addition to the aforementioned lighting tech, is modern post-processing. There's camera and per-object motion blur, which looks good although the sampling artifacts are a little bit obvious, as well as an excellent bokeh depth of field effect. These elements particularly shine in the real-time cutscenes. These scenes are really impressive, showcasing great character modeling and animations. The focal blur gives these scenes a cinematic feel that you just don't often see on Switch. Cutscenes are definitely the graphical highlight of Shin Megami Tensei V, though this has been achieved at the cost of framerate, as we'll see later. But there are some aspects of the graphical presentation that do feel a little bit dated. There are some issues with detail at a distance, for instance. Object pop-in is very obvious. Shadow cascades are very clear and change quite close to the player. Just look at the shadows next to this barrier here. Character animations more than a few meters away also run at a low frame rate. These aren't unexpected compromises, but they do hurt the sense of visual cohesion and stability. The UI looks a bit plain at times, with simple sans serif fonts and somewhat basic menus that seem a little bit at odds with the overall visual styling of the game. Atlas's Persona and Tokyo Mirage Sessions titles feel like a more complete visual package overall, with unique looking UI and menus. Gameplay UI elements are also a bit large and obtrusive by default, although there are options to hide them if you like. The transition effect that is used when moving between the gameplay and menus also looks a bit garish and cheap, and seems somewhat choppy, as if the animation is making the game drop frames. It's not a big deal, but I think a simple fade would have worked better here. Combat could also use a bit more impact. The camera work and animations just don't really come together to properly emphasize player abilities, unlike in recent Atlas titles like Persona 5. Most abilities feel a little bit basic and unexciting as a result, although animations for special abilities and boss characters have a bit more style. Finally, lip sync is rather poor for the English voice track, which is a bit visually off-putting if you prefer to play the dubbed release. Just take a look.
今集団下校が推奨されているだろう。よかったら僕らと帰らないか？僕ら家族は二人きりだ。それに
You heard that talk about it being safer to go home in groups, right? You should walk with us. We're the only family we've got. I don't think it's that strange to look out for my little sister.
It's unfortunate that we don't see a better match here. A more careful dub could have minimized the issue as well. In the end, however, I do think that Shin Megami Tensei V is a great looking Switch game. Technically ambitious Switch exclusives are a bit of a rarity, but that's exactly what we're seeing here. The primary visual issues stem from limitations of the source hardware, but the underlying strength of the graphical presentation still shines through. It's a visually accomplished title that is clearly pushing the Switch hard, but perhaps somewhat too hard. With that in mind, let's take a look at resolution and performance. Shin Megami Tensei V uses a dynamic resolution setup, with resolution varying depending on load. In docked mode, resolution hangs between 720p and 864p, with a typical resolution around 792p. In portable mode, resolution falls between 540p and 720p, with a typical resolution around 648p. It's possible that resolution could dip lower, of course, in extreme circumstances. In common with most Switch games, the docked presentation tends to feel a little bit dated, with image quality comparable to many titles from the PS3 360 era. Shin Megami Tensei still holds up favorably to ports of current-gen games on Switch, but we do typically see a higher resolution image in other Switch exclusives. At least the image does look fairly clear, owing to the lack of anti-aliasing. Portable play is another story entirely, with a crisp-looking, relatively clean image that looks great on the Switch's display. The resolution here is typically close enough to 720p that the game has a native res look. All the visual faults of the docked game are still present here, prominent pop-in and shadow cascades for instance, but they are much less annoying on the small, sharp Switch panel. Performance, unfortunately, well, this is where things truly fall apart. Viewers may have noticed some inconsistencies in the footage shown so far, and there's good reason for that. Shin Megami Tensei V targets 30 frames per second, but almost never reaches that target. The game spends most of its time in the upper 20s, with severe dips below at times. Virtually any 3D scene will see the frame rate stay below 30 frames per second almost all the time. The game has constant stutter as a result. It feels almost as if Shin Megami Tensei has been set to target a lower frame rate, or there is some bizarre frame pacing issue, but it's actually possible to get a flat 30 FPS readout in very limited circumstances. Angling the camera directly at the sky, or towards certain lower density areas, can see a 30 FPS frame rate with properly implemented frame pacing. The overworld map also runs at a consistent 30 frames per second. But for the vast majority of gameplay, the frame rate hovers between 27 and 29 frames per second. The frame rate feels horrible and results in frame time inconsistency and perpetual judder, even in very basic scenes. There's something extremely odd going on here. It doesn't feel like most of the drops in general gameplay are related to rendering load. Gameplay frame rate is actually at its worst in the first few seconds after loading, for instance, suggesting that some sort of CPU bottleneck may be the culprit. But that's not the worst of it. Dips down to the high teens are possible, although these mostly occur in cinematic scenes. Cinematics in general perform quite poorly, with typical frame rates in the low to mid-20s. Depth of field and some of the alpha effects seem to drag performance, which makes sense given the Switch's low bandwidth. These scenes are visually impressive, but the visuals on display here do carry a serious performance penalty. There are a handful of pre-encoded video sequences, however, including the opening cutscene, which do maintain 30 frames per second. Portable performance is generally comparable to docked performance, with a similar feeling readout in general play. There's just no escaping Shin Megami Tensei V's poor stability. Of course, Shin Megami Tensei V is a turn-based game with little need for fast or consistent real-time response, so these issues have minimal impact on gameplay. But that feels like a small solace considering the problems at hand here. We've seen some impressive UE4 titles on Switch after all, including stunning and performant titles like Dragon Quest XI and Yoshi's Crafted World, so these frame rate issues are especially befuddling. Mainstream graphics engines like Unreal and Unity don't have to produce bad results on lower powered platforms. We have countless examples to the contrary. I'm hoping performance can be improved, but Shin Megami Tensei V runs very poorly on the Switch at the moment. And that's a real shame, because there's a beautiful game underneath it all here. Perhaps at some point, the game will be fixed or will receive a port to a more powerful platform that can push past these issues. For now, Shin Megami Tensei V is a boundary-pushing Switch game that often impresses, with great-looking characters, cohesive environments, and alluring post-processing. However, this is tempered with some of the worst performance I've seen in a major Switch release. It's still an excellent and attractive game, but the frame rate issues are impossible to ignore. But with that, we've reached the end of this video. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for notifications for new videos. To view a high-quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch, just use Twitter. That's all for me for now. Thanks for watching.